The conference next turned to Professor William C. Chittick, Professor of Comparative Literary and Cultural Studies at the State University of New York, Stony Brook. In his talk, The Traditional Approach to Learning, Professor Chittick delivered an intriguing look into how one ancient tradition, Confucianism, considers the purpose of education to be a profound awakening of each individual, and how other traditions, particularly Islam in this case, have a similar perspective. We come to understand that traditional learning, almost by definition, seeks a goal that is now nearly incomprehensible to modern non-traditional societies.
I want to begin by quoting Mencius, the second great sage of the Confucian tradition. Mencius said, "The way of learning is nothing other than to seek for the lost heart." The word here for way is Tao, which everyone knows is the key concept in Taoism, but not everyone realizes it plays an almost equally important role in Confucianism as it does in Chinese language Islam. One of its meanings, as in this text from Mencius, is the road or the path or the process, the road you need to follow to accomplish the goal. The goal in this case is learning. For the time being, we can take the word learning to mean in Chinese what it means in English, to gain understanding. I prefer not to say to gain a knowledge, though the word also means that, because nowadays people tend to confuse knowledge with facts and information, with the idea that we are here to become successful in our lives and careers. But it does not tell us why we should care about our lives and careers. It does not have the means to ask the big questions like, why are we really here? What is the meaning of life? Instead of addressing questions like this, modern learning focuses on the acquisition of knowledge that has no relevance to our fundamental task in life, which is to become truly human. In the Chinese language, gaining the truly important knowledge used to be called the great learning, dashui. In the traditional context, to learn something means to come to understand it, and to understand the big issues of life demands engaging in the quest for the great learning. The goal of that learning is to fit all things into the overall picture and thereby make sense of them. But what exactly is the overall picture? What defines its limits? In order to gain real understanding of things, we need to know that picture. And in turn, is determined by the worldview of the tradition in question. For those who are active and engaged members of the tradition, the worldview shapes and forms their tacit assumptions about life and living, their attitudes toward people and things, and the goals that they set for themselves. It is this traditional context that puts Confucian learning in a very different category from what we do at schools and universities. Let me come back to the saying of Mencius. The way of learning is nothing other than to seek for the lost heart. The key to grasping what he means here lies in the word heart. In books on Chinese thought, this word is usually translated as mind. More recently, many scholars say heart and mind, or mind and heart. The Chinese character refers in the first place to the fleshly heart, the physical organ, but generally it designates the seat of our personhood. Classical Chinese thought uses the term in the same way that it used to be used in other pre-modern civilizations, to designate the locus of consciousness and awareness, the deepest recesses of selfhood, the point of contact between the divine and the human. Islamic texts like to quote a saying that is attributed to the Prophet, who tells us that God says, "My heavens and my earth do not embrace me, but the heart of my believing servant does embrace me." In this traditional sense of the word, heart refers to a power of intuitive intelligence and spiritual awareness that transcends rational processes and unifies the knowing subject with the known object. When the word is translated as mind, it is typically done so to follow modern usage, according to which the mind pertains to the rational, discursive, and analytical functions of the human self. And the heart refers to emotions and feelings. In traditional thought, however, such cognitive functions, the rational functions, while rooted in the heart, pertain only to the more external aspects of its engagement with reality, those that support duality, difference, and otherness. In contrast, understanding that pertains to the true heart brings about unity and sameness. Now let me provide a typical example of discussion of the heart from the Confucian tradition. The ancient classic, called the Book of Rites, tells us that man is the heart of heaven and earth. In explaining what this means, the great 16th century Confucian master, Wang Yangming, says that the heart is spiritual clarity, or luminous unitary intelligence. And it is the reality that lies behind all appearances. Among the myriad things between heaven and earth, only human beings have access to the heart. One writes, I quote, "We know then that in all that fills heaven and earth there is but this spiritual clarity. It is only because of people's forms and bodies that they are separate. My spiritual clarity is the Lord ruler of heaven and earth, of spirits and demons. Separated from my spiritual clarity, there will be no heaven and earth, no spirits and demons, no myriad things." Now, but what does Mencius, who was writing more than 1,000, almost 2,000 years earlier, what does Mencius mean by the lost heart? If we say in modern English, with no explanation, that someone has lost his heart, we mean he's fallen in love. And if we say that he's lost his mind, we mean he's gone mad. But Mencius is not talking about love or madness. Certainly not in these senses of the word. His primary point is that learning should be focused on recovering the most precious dimension of our own being, something of utmost importance to us. We had that precious something, but now we have lost it. So our human task is to find it again. In short, Mencius is lamenting the situation of most people who have lost touch with the innate luminosity and inherent goodness of the human heart that the Chinese call grand. Humanity, human-heartedness, humaneness, benevolence. You'll find many attempts at translations of grand. The problem is it's the key virtue in all of Confucianism. It's the key concept in the whole Confucian tradition because it designates our true human nature, authentic goodness and virtue. And according to the Confucian tradition, all efforts should be focused upon achieving it. As Tu Wei-ming, whom Dr. Nasser also mentioned, among others, reminds us, the whole Confucian tradition is focused on achieving this ren, which or as he puts it, this is one of his favorite phrases, on learning how to be human. We are not born human, nor do we just grow up to be human. Rather, ren is a spiritual quality, a luminous clarity, an ultimate goodness that needs to be pursued. For Mencius, the lost heart is nothing other than this true human nature. This becomes clear when we quote his saying in its context. Grand, he says, is man's heart, and righteousness his road. Sad indeed. It is to neglect the road and not to follow it, to lose the heart and not to know enough to go after it. When someone loses his chickens and dogs, he knows enough to go after them. But when he loses his heart, he does not know enough to seek for it. The way of learning is nothing other than to seek for the lost heart. Now, given that our understanding of the significance and role of learning depends upon our worldview, I need to take a rather lengthy detour now to clarify the Confucian and Muslim worldviews. Crazy thing to do, but I'll do my best. In doing so, I am still trying to look through the eyes of the Chinese Muslims who began writing about their religion in the Chinese language in the 17th century. Those scholars were happy to accept the general Confucian worldview, and they praised its focus on bringing personal and social life into conformity with the Tao of heaven and earth, a goal that they understood to be exactly parallel to Islamic teachings. Nonetheless, they did not find Confucianism sufficient in its explanations of the human situation in the universe. You might think that the Muslim critique of Confucianism was based on the fact that Confucianism does not talk about a personal God, in contrast to Islam. In fact, however, the Muslim scholars, who were well trained, by the way, also in Confucianism, not only in Confucianism, but also in Taoism and Buddhism, they had no difficulty accepting basic Confucian notions about the supreme principle, the real substance, the ultimate truth. These are standard Chinese terms. They had countless parallel discussions from which to draw in their own Arabic and Persian texts. So they found nothing strange about this impersonal depiction of the ultimate real, of God. Now, it may be useful here to recall that the Islamic worldview is built on three basic principles. The first is Tawheed, the assertion that God is one. The key to the meaning of God's oneness, however, is found in the formula of witnessing, the Shahada, the first pillar of Muslim practice and the foundation of faith. To be a Muslim, as everyone knows, one begins by acknowledging there is no God but God. The words of Tawheed, the words of unity. Tawheed, unity, has two basic implications. These become clear when we insert any of the so-called 99 names of God in the formula of Tawheed. God is powerful, so there is none powerful but God. God is merciful, so there is none merciful but God. God is loving, so there is none loving but God. The first implication is that God alone is truly God, truly real, truly one, truly alive, truly knowing, truly powerful, truly loving, and so on, down the list of the 99 names. This means that anything other than God does not and cannot possess these qualities on its own. The divinity, reality, oneness, life, knowledge, power, all are exclusively divine attributes. Now, the second implication of the formula is that everything in the universe receives whatever reality it may have from God. In other words, there is none powerful but God means that everything we call power can only be a sign or a trace of the divine power, bestowed upon created things by the one reality. Thus, the whole universe is, in terms of the Quran, a vast collection of signs, ayat, pointing to God as the ultimate reality and supreme principle. It is perhaps worth stressing here that this way of thinking about God does not allow for any real break between the divine and the human, or God and creation. Yes, God is infinitely transcendent, but He is also omnipresent. One of the results of this way of looking at things is that Islam has no concept of deism, which depends upon severing the links between the divine and the human. Most people nowadays, whether they know it or not, tend to think of God in deist terms. For example, religious people who imagine that the Big Bang marks the moment of creation, or that scientific notions of causality or evolution are sufficient to explain the nature of the world, are taking deist positions. In other words, they think that God, having created the world, then either lets the world run its course, the so-called clockwork universe, or he stands off at a distance and rarely interferes, or he only interferes when things really start getting out of hand. You might call the last one the lightning bolt theory, right? Such notions of God's aloofness are totally alien to the Islamic tradition. On the contrary, all things are utterly dependent on the supreme reality at every instant of their existence. There are absolutely no gaps in the divine omnipresence. Now, this brief explanation of Tawhid follows in the line of numerous books written in Arabic and Persian over the past 1,000 years. The Neo-Confucian scholars constantly talk about the supreme principle as that which underlies all that is at every moment, always and forever. The Muslim Chinese, reading Neo-Confucian texts as they did, saw no contradiction between the basic Confucian views of reality and the standpoints found in their own Islamic sources. It was clear to them that Chinese thought is rooted in Tawhid. Now, the second basic principle of Islam, as you all know, is prophecy. Here you might think that the Chinese Muslims would have had trouble expressing their teachings in Chinese terms. On the contrary, they had no difficulties because they followed the basic teaching of the Quran that God sent a prophet to every people. They recognized that the Chinese had their own prophets, but they called them sages in the Chinese language. Hence, the Muslims simply spoke of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and other Quranic prophets as sages. And they accepted that God sent sages to all peoples, just as did the Neo-Confucian thinkers. The Muslims found that the description of the characteristics of sages, as found in the Chinese classics, such as, for example, the Doctrine of the Mean, one of the four really great, really important Confucian classics, the descriptions of the sages were completely in keeping with their own understanding of prophecy. And they often quoted from the Neo-Confucian scholars on these topics. One of the favorite passages of Muslim scholars is from the 12th century Neo-Confucian, Lu Juyan. Let me read this for you. Sages appeared tens of thousands of generations ago. They shared this heart. They shared this principle. Sages will appear tens of thousands of generations to come. They will share this heart. They will share this principle. Over the four seas, sages appear. They share this heart. They share this principle. Now, the third of the three principles of Islamic faith is Ma'ad, the return to God. And is this principle that Muslims found to be insufficiently explained in Chinese texts. So they paid special attention to clarifying its meaning. In fact, the single most influential book translated from an Islamic language into Chinese before the 20th century was not, as you might expect, the Quran, but a 13th century Persian classic written by a great spiritual teacher, Najmuddin Razi. The book was extremely popular throughout the Persianate world. That is, from Turkey, through Persia and Central Asia to India. It is a long but poetic and extremely readable account of what it means to be human and how we may go about achieving the fullness of our humanity. The title of the book translates as this: the path of the servants, human creatures, the path of the servants from the origin to the return. That this book focuses on the third principle of Islamic faith, the return to God, as indicated already by its title. Moreover, it follows the Quran by discussing the return to God in terms of the origin from God. The basic meaning of this third principle of faith is that people go back where they came from, which is the presence of God. Now you might say, doesn't Islam teach that everyone ends up in either heaven or hell? The answer is yes, but we only get there first by meeting God. We meet him in terms of his names and attributes. If we meet him as merciful and forgiving and beautiful, then certainly we will end up in paradise. But if we meet him as just, wrathful, and vengeful, we will not be so fortunate. How we meet him depends on how we live our lives. One cannot stress too much that the notion of origin and return is central to Islamic thinking. Without understanding it, people have no orientation. Moreover, we should not forget that it is simply an application of the principle of Tawheed, which tells us that everything comes from God, everything is sustained by God, and everything goes back where it came from. For the Chinese Muslims, seeking for the lost heart meant trying to recover one's original situation with God. According to the Quran, after creating the universe with its myriad kinds, including not only plants and animals, but also angels and demons, God created Adam. That is the original human being, or human beings in general. Moreover, he created Adam with a purpose in life, that is to be his vicegerent, or representative on earth. This issue of human vicegerency, which Dr. Nass has already spoken about, is central to traditional Islamic thinking. If we can understand what a vicegerent is, then we can understand why God created us. Vicegerency is the answer to the big questions. Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? So, what exactly is a vicegerent? In the passage of the Quran where God says that he has appointed Adam as his vicegerent, it also says that God taught him all the names. These are the names of all things, including the names of God. We cannot live up to the proper function that God has given us, that of representing him, if we do not know his creation and if we do not know him. After all, name here does not simply mean designation. God did not bestow on Adam encyclopedias of information. He gave him understanding. When Adam came to know all things, he was aware of their realities and the significance of their realities. He understood them in their big context. From the outset, he was given the great learning, which allowed him to know the exact significance of every form of small learning. If any of you are not familiar with Islamic teachings, I should point out that Adam is not only the first vicegerent, but also the first prophet, the first sage, the first complete and perfect human being. He played exactly the role that God created him for, and he did such a good job of it that he should be imitated by all of us. He was also, of course, the first sinner. His sin, however, was that, as the Quran put it, he disobeyed. That is, the command not to approach the tree. In the same passage of the Quran, however, God provides the excuse. He forgot. After all, the Quran also tells us elsewhere, man was created weak. In the Quranic account, the moment God asked Adam and Eve why they ate the forbidden fruit, they recognized their mistake and asked forgiveness, and God forgave them both. And that was the end of their forgetfulness. Now, to come back to the issues of the names that God taught to Adam, many commentators explain human vicegerency in terms of the biblical saying, also repeated by Muhammad, that God created Adam in his own form, or his own image. The only way that human beings can represent God is by reflecting his total reality within themselves. Adam was taught all the names, not just some of them. And when God teaches something, it really sinks in, which is to say that it involves a transformation of the very being of the learner. According to the Quran, I quote, God's only command to a thing when he desires it is to say to it, be. And it comes to be. When God said, be to Adam, Adam came into being. And that being was a full and plenary manifestation of God's supreme reality. which is designated by the 99 most beautiful names. It is within the being and awareness of Adam that God reveals and discloses his own reality, all of his names. Only on this basis can Adam know God and represent God. So, Adam was created as God's vicegerent. In the language of Islamic theology, Adam is a compulsory servant because he must obey the creative command to come into being. Everything, of course, serves God in this respect. All things are compulsory servants of God. What makes Adam different from all the other servants of God is precisely that God taught him all the names, not just some of the names. Bees know the names of flowers. Frogs know the name of bugs. But Adam knows the names of everything. That everything includes God. God is creator and destroyer. God is merciful and wrathful. God is just and forgiving. And this knowledge is woven into his very being. It is this existential knowledge of all the names that bestows upon Adam his freedom of choice. In terms of the formula of Tawheed, there is none free but God. As the Quran puts it, God does what he desires. Human beings made in the image of that free God have a certain freedom. Only because Adam recognized his own freedom did he feel responsible for disobeying the command of God not to approach the tree. And his own sense of responsibility drove him to ask forgiveness from God. The first command was God's creative command, or engendering command. The second was, in the technical language of theology, a prescriptive command. God's creative command brings us into the world. His prescriptive command instructs us to observe good works, good deeds, good words, good deeds, and good thoughts, or right speech, right activity, and right understanding. By issuing this latter command, God tells us not to lie, steal, commit murder. He tells us to pray, keep God in mind at all times, to perform acts of charity. He tells us to use our intelligence to understand his ways. Human beings then are faced with two commands. They can never disobey the first one, which tells them to come into being. They can only disobey the second command, which comes by way of the prophets and sages. Its pivotal importance for human destiny explains why prophecy is the second principle of Islamic thought. The prophets and sages explain the right way of being and doing, and they provide the instructions that people need in order to live up to the vicegerency that God has bestowed upon them. Now, coming again to the third principle of Islam, it tells us, on the one hand, that we are compulsory creatures of God. Where we do have a say is in dealing with the prescriptive command. Do we choose to follow it, to ignore it, to reject it, to deny that it even exists? All of these are options given to us by our freedom. In any case, according to Tawheed, everyone and everything will return to God. So in this respect, the return is called the compulsory return. Among human beings, however, many will choose to follow the instructions of God in order to live up to the requisites of servanthood and to try to make themselves worthy for vicegerency. They do this by engaging in the return voluntarily. That is, by following his instructions as issued to the prophets. This voluntary return is precisely the Tao, in the sense that we saw Mencius using the term. It is the way of learning how to be human and to act appropriately that leads to the recovery of our lost heart. Most Sufi teachers have held that the path of the voluntary return is nothing other than the path of love. Love, as everyone knows, is the motive force that brings about nearness between lovers. Love for God is precisely what drives the worshiper to seek nearness to him. The Quran recognizes love's importance in many verses, but it stresses the fact that if you want to love God as he is worthy to be loved, there are proper ways to do so. What is the proper way to show dedication and devotion when dealing with God? The Quran answers the question in this way. Say, it's addressing Muhammad. Say, Muhammad, tell them, in other words, if you love God, follow me, and God will love you. So, the procedures and protocols in love for God are rooted in following the Prophet. This helps explain the essential role played in Islam by the Sunnah, that is, the exemplary acts and deeds of Muhammad. Now, this verse tells us that the end result of following in the footsteps of Muhammad is that God will love those who do so. Now, of course, I should add a footnote here. No one denies that God loves us in any case. If he didn't love us, he wouldn't have created us in the first place. However, we need to remember that he even loves those whom he puts in hell. So God's universal love does not necessarily yield the benefit that we might expect. To say that God loves everyone without exception is like saying he is with you wherever you are. This does not mean that we are with him, nor does it mean that we participate in the blessings and peace of his unity. The human problem is that forgetfulness and heedlessness prevent us from seeing God wherever we are and from entering into his presence. We have lost our hearts. And until we find them again, we will remain far from him. If we want to find our lost hearts and be with God, then we need to follow what the Chinese Muslims call li. Propriety is the usual translation, sometimes ritual, propriety and ritual. These are the two translations of the Chinese character. In Confucian terms, propriety is the absolute foundation of a proper and worthy society. And it is determined by the norms set down by the ancient sages and emperors. Someone once asked Confucius how to become fully and properly human. That is, how to achieve Ren, this human-heartedness. Confucius replied, discipline yourself by observing propriety. For the Chinese Muslims, propriety is precisely the sunnah of Muhammad as codified in the Sharia. And the discipline is called the Tao, which is the word they use to translate the Arabic word tariqah. That is, the spiritual path. The Quran says that when people follow Muhammad, God will love them. When God does love them, what happens then? Here, a well-attested hadith provides the answer. The hadith is of the Qudsi or holy type, which is to say that the Prophet is quoting again the words of God. In the hadith, God tells us that his servant follows the path of the voluntary return by observing the obligations laid upon him by the prescriptive command. He may achieve, when he does it, he may achieve the presence with God. Here I quote from the hadith, my servant, God is speaking, my servant never ceases drawing near to me through voluntary works until I love him. Then, when I love him, I am his hearing through which he hears, his sight through which he sees, his hand through which he grasps, and his foot through which he walks. We see here that when the servant follows Muhammad out of love for God, then in loving him back, God becomes somehow indistinguishable from the servant. It certainly points to a mysterious conjunction between the divine and the human, a conjunction that occurs first of all in the heart. This conjunction is possible only because people were created in the full and plenary image of God, so they can love God as God, not simply as provider or benefactor or forgiver or some other specific name. In the case of love for God, he knows perfectly well the secrets of our hearts. So he becomes the hearing and seeing only of those who truly love him for his sake alone. That is a rare situation indeed. So the only sure examples we have of those who have achieved it are the prophets and the sages, such as Muhammad and Confucius. Many Muslim thinkers refer to the lost heart by the Quranic term fitra, original creation. Fitra is the divine form that God bestowed upon Adam when he created him. Or it is the divine spirit that, according to the Quran, God blew into the clay of Adam in order to bring him to life. Now, any discussion of origins, and original things, and the original heart in Islam has everything to do with explaining how God created the universe in stages, beginning with the invisible divine spirit, which is the breath of God that he blew into Adam. This spirit, this first creation of God, is called by many names, such as the first intelligence, or the supreme pen, or the Mohammedan reality. It is a single reality that is aware of all things, and it is this that gave Adam his knowledge of all the names. Or we can say that the first spirit is the creative command of God, his word, be, to all things. The Chinese Muslims have this last interpretation in mind, I think, when they call this spirit, as they often do, the mandate of heaven. What is perfectly obvious to all Muslim thinkers is that human beings, in coming into this world from the divine command, begin as invisible spirits. The movement goes from spirit to body, from life, true life, to death, from consciousness to unawareness. It is commonly called the descending arc of existence. The Chinese Muslims called it the former heaven. That is, the heavenly realm where we existed before our entrance into the earth. Once we exist as embodied human beings, we begin to ascend in order to go back where we came from. The Chinese Muslims call the realm into which we ascend the latter heaven, because we only enter into it after embodiment. We can all see the process of ascent taking place in the growth of children toward greater understanding and self-awareness. Infants are perhaps not at first able to distinguish themselves from their environment or their bodies. Only gradually do they come to realize that they are aware and that they are distinct individuals. I can remember myself, I think of my first real memories. I'm me, I'm different. I'm like one of them, I think it was. Anyway, all this is part of the natural flow of existence that follows upon the creative command, be. He tells us to be humans. We're born, we start growing up. We're still moving according to nature, as the Chinese would have called it. Thus, we have two movements in human existence. First, there is emergence from non-manifestation to manifestation, from invisibility to visibility, from inside to outside, from heaven to earth, from spirit to body. Then there is a reversal of the flow of existence as things start moving from outside to inside, from immersion in the senses and bodily functions toward awareness and understanding, from constraint toward freedom, from forgetfulness and ignorance toward remembrance and awakening. It is this latter movement that is called learning. According to Islamic law, observance of the prescriptive command becomes mandatory at puberty. This is the time when we are sufficiently self-aware to understand that we have responsibilities toward our Creator, toward other human beings, and toward our own immortal soul, which wants to live in happiness, not just in this world, but also in the next world. The prophet said, knowledge without practice is a tree without fruit. Knowledge is understanding who we are and what we should be doing about it. Practice is actually doing what we should be doing. And that is based on observing propriety and following the way. In Islamic terms, the Sharia and the Tariqah. We do not reach a point where we can relax and say that we have learned everything that we need to know. Search for knowledge, the Prophet said, from the cradle to the grave. The Quran even commands the Prophet himself to pray with the words, "My Lord, increase me in knowledge." Now, if the greatest of all the sages had to pray for increase in knowledge, where does that leave the rest of us? Now, if Mencius were asked how we can go about recovering the lost heart, he would certainly have pointed to Confucius himself, the model for those Chinese who would like to engage in the quest, just as Muhammad is the model for all Muslims. In a famous passage of the Analects, Confucius sets down the stages that need to be traversed in order to achieve the goal. He said, "From 50, I set my heart on learning. From 30, I stood firm. From 40, I had no doubts. From 50, I knew the mandate of heaven. From 60, my ear was obedient. From 70, I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the right, without overstepping the true, without overstepping the proper." As a round number, 15 designates the time of puberty, precisely the age at which, in Islamic terms, it becomes incumbent on Muslims to follow the guidance of the Quran and the Prophet. 15 is the age when we are old enough to understand the difference between right and wrong, true and false, good and evil. It is the age at which the prescriptive command comes to determine the way we develop, rather than simply the creative command. For extremely gifted people like Confucius, it is the age of engaging in the quest for self-realization. The next stage in the Confucian path is the age of 30, when the seeker stands firm and is completely grounded in the quest for the lost heart. From 40, he has no doubts about the rightness of his quest for more understanding. In the Islamic context, 40, you'll remember, is the age when Muhammad became a prophet. And some Sufi teachers have said that it is the age of spiritual maturity, when those who travel the path to perfection are opened up to the fullness of their own human nature. At 50, the seeker comes to know the mandate of heaven, which is to say, in Islamic terms, that he knows not only God's prescriptive command, what people should do, but also his creative command, the destiny that God has doled out to his creatures. Then at 60, his ear is obedient. Perhaps this means that at the previous stage, although he knew exactly what heaven wanted from him, something of his own self-interest and self-centeredness still stood in the way of his submission to the heavenly command. Now at 60, whatever he does is in keeping with the mandate of heaven. He follows the prescriptive command in all of its details. Only at 70 does the lost heart make its explicit appearance. It is then that the seeker can follow his heart's desire without overstepping the right. There is no trace of self-centeredness left. He is firmly rooted in the prescriptive command, so what his heart wants is nothing other than what heaven wants, which is to say that there's no longer any distinction to be drawn between the prescriptive command and the creative command. God saying be to him is exactly what he does, and that's in keeping with the Sharia, with propriety. Having found his lost heart, the finder does as he desires, just like God does as he desires. For in fact, his desire and God's desire are the same thing. Let me end with one more quotation. It's from the Confucian classic, called by the name I've been using all along, The Great Learning. It's a very short text, as a matter of fact. I mean, the classic itself is only a few pages long. Nonetheless, it is considered by later Confucians as one of the four great and foundational classics of Confucianism, along with Confucius, Mencius, and the Doctrine of the Mean. You have the four books in later Confucianism. This, again, is a very famous passage. Those of you familiar with Chinese thought will know it, but I hope it clarifies what I've been trying to say. This is ascribed to Confucius, or maybe sometimes to his grandson. In any case, it's a very ancient text and considered sort of the quintessence of the Confucian way. The ancients who wished to clarify their clear virtue under heaven would first govern their countries. Those who wished to govern their countries would first regulate their families. Those who wished to regulate their families would first cultivate their personal lives. Those who wished to cultivate their personal lives would first make their hearts true. Rectify their hearts, as it's sometimes translated. Those who wish to make their hearts true would first make their intentions sincere. Those who wish to make their intentions sincere would first extend their knowledge, would engage in the quest for learning. From the Son of Heaven down to the common people, all must regard cultivation of the personal life as the root or foundation. There is never a case when the root is in disorder and yet the branches are in order. Now, this cultivation of the personal life, that is the root of both the person and society, is none other than the quest to recover the lost heart. As long as we do not recover it, our lives will remain disordered and incomplete, and we will not be able to live in peace and harmony with our own selfhoods, much less with our fellow men. It is this recovery of our hearts and our rightful places in the universe that is the goal of traditional learning. Thank you.